Hello, my name is Chris Cook, President of Cape, and I'm joined today by Dr. Melina Monaco, our Vice President. Today we're going to cover Cape in the pandemic era and post-pandemic, as well as some of the benefits of Cape accreditation and our new standards. The value of accreditation serving both the purposes of accountability and continuous improvement are that it provides an independent assessment of quality and standards for states and for the public, increasingly offers opportunities for reciprocity, and helps with the reflective use of data to guide curricular decisions and a culture and structure for data-driven decision-making within your institutions. And it also provides a mechanism for improvement and innovation. And many providers who have gone through Cape tells us that it validates efforts of continuous improvement and excellence within institutions. We moved and planned to move prior to the pandemic to virtual visits and fully moved to those in 2020, obviously, with 26 being done virtually in the spring of 2020, and then in the fall 51, and in spring 2021 we plan to do 96 virtual visits. This is going to be the new normal for Cape. We've found from our accreditation visits that they're well received in the field. They do lead to a cost reduction of around, on average, 20% for providers the year of their evaluation. And as long as they're planned effectively, they work very effectively for all parties involved. Our accreditation council and board meetings have been virtual through 2020. We will certainly in 2021 begin with virtual meetings for the accreditation council in April, and we're assessing and will continue to assess whether that can continue on a regular basis. Certainly we'd like to do at least one in-person board meeting annually in the future, but we'll have to see how things transpire in order to make that decision. I want to talk a bit about two board committees that were influential in impacting the revision of the standards that will go into effect in spring of 2022. One is our Standing Equity and Diversity Committee. The other is the Standing Research Committee of the board. Both committees were put in place because we knew that these issues would continually be important to accreditation and to the customers we serve. We had a clear, in June, we established a clear purpose for each committee for the year. And certainly over the last couple years, it's been to dive into data and implementation data from our first 300 accreditation visits and make determinations on changes that should be made. I'm going to pass over now to Dr. Melina Monaco, who will talk a little bit about the process that was used and how this information was utilized by the task force in making recommendations for the revision to our standards. Melina?
Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about our revision model. A big part of 2020 was the revision of the initial standards. Every 7 years, by policy, we are to review standards, and 2020 happened to be the year that we did that. We use a stakeholder-focused revision model to review the initial standards. It starts with the board. As Chris mentioned, there are two board committees, Research and Diversity and Equity, and the work of those committees actually began in 2019. So they began their work looking at data from the 250 or so cases that have gone through Cape accreditation, looking at their data, looking at where EPPs were struggling, looking at the data that they presented as evidence, and writing reports to start this process. Once those board committee reports were completed, a task force was formed, and this happened over the summer, and we worked to incorporate what the board provided us, plus some other features, to really look at the standards. Then we had three pre-vetted groups, the spring 2022 EPPs, which were going to be implementing the revised standards, our state partners to make sure we were incorporating all the requirements of our partnership agreements, and then all of our volunteers. So our leads, our reviewers, the AC, were all parts of those pre-vetted groups. Our work went back to the board for approval, went out for public comment. Those public comments went back to the task force for review and incorporation, and then went finally to the board for final approval. So that was the process. That all happened in calendar year 2020. And we were really focused on making sure that all of our stakeholders were involved in this process and had a voice. And so the task force was representative of many different groups. And we wanted to have as many voices as possible on the committee. So we did have Cape volunteers, reviewers, site leads, members of the Cape board, members of the Accreditation Council. We had members, EPP members, mostly comprising of the spring 2022 EPPs, but other EPPs as well. We had our state partners. So we had 3 different state partnership liaisons as part of our task force. And a very important voice within our group was P12 teachers. So we had 2 current practicing P12 teachers. One is a member of our Accreditation Council, and one is actually a reviewer. And so, but they are currently practicing teachers, and that was an important voice that we wanted to make sure was part of the discussion of the revisions. And then we had external groups. So we had members from Branch Ed, SREB, NEA, ATE. We also had a member from the Family and Community Engagement Group and community colleges. So we had several external groups also on the task force. Once the task force recommendations went to the board and were approved, it went out for general public comment. And so anybody could make comments on the standards themselves. And so we had 45 days of public comment. The task force charge was to review the data and reports from the board committee, research and equity and diversity, also looking at the U.S. Department of Ed and CHIA guidelines. So we needed to incorporate any requirements for CHIA, which is our accreditor. And also we were seeking and are seeking the U.S. Department of Ed recognition. And so we wanted to make sure that all aspects of the US DOE requirements were also incorporated into the revisions. We had data from the Accreditation Council decisions and feedback. So our Accreditation Council meets twice a year, and we had data from those decisions. So where AFI and stipulations were being recommended, and if there was any pattern or way that we could improve training or discuss with EPPs moving forward to clarify. So we had that data. And then we had field comments from EPPs, reviewers, and leads as they go through this process. So again, a very important set of data that we started with. But our task was not to come up with new standards. Our task was to revise the 2013 standards and components. And so we were looking for some key concepts. We were looking where there was overlap or redundancy, and to work on eliminating that. We were looking at the consolidation. So where there was redundancy, could we consolidate into a standard or component? And then clarity of language. So again, making sure that if it was brought up in some of our data that there was vagueness or over specificity or just not clear. We wanted to make sure the language was very clear on the expectations for the EPP and the expectations for reviewers. So, so those were our 3 main ideas, and then we did update language. The last standards were done in 2013, and so we wanted to make sure we were updated on all the language within the standards and up to date on that. So the 50,000-foot view of the process for the end result was we did consolidate quite a few of the components. So when you see that there's a consolidated component, it doesn't mean that the piece that came out was just removed. It was generally consolidated into other components. And so so we didn't really eliminate, we consolidated. So standard 1, I put an asterisk there because standard 1 I think looks the most different than some of the other components and standards. we really focused on being explicit about the expectations within Standard 1 and provided clarity for EPPs on what was to be included in each of the components. So I think there was just a lot of work on Standard 1. Standard 1 is a pretty large component of accreditation, and we wanted to make sure that that particular standard was clear to the field. Standard 2, we clarified some language. We really didn't add or edit a whole lot of Standard 2. We did make a reference to modalities in clinical experiences to ensure that candidates were getting some experience with virtual or hybrid instruction during their preparation. That has become very important moving forward, and so that was a timely addition to Standard 2. Standard 3, we did quite a bit of consolidation. We actually went from 6 components down to 3, and we, I think, reconceptualized the old 3.2, which was the test score requirement and GPA requirement, and really reconceptualized that into something, I think, authentic and that the field was very happy with. And I'll show you that when we get to that slide. But so that was a big reconceptualization of the components within the standard. And then Standard 4, we added some flexibility to the old 4.1, and we consolidated components again where we felt was most efficient. Standard 5, not a lot of change, just clarified language, reordered the components a little bit, and consolidated. So that standard was not really touched that much. And we embedded the content for crosscuts into the components, and we removed them as crosscuts. And that was, I think, a big piece from the Equity and Diversity Committee, was really looking at how to incorporate those ideas of diversity and equity back into components where they were clearly articulated and expectations were listed for EPPs, for reviewers, for the Accreditation Council. And I think it gave it more of a focus and brought it to the forefront a little bit more than the crosscuts had done. So I listed in the presentation each of the revisions to each of the standards, just so that you would have that in your PowerPoint and could see them, and I'll refer to a few additions as we go through. So Standard 1, if you notice, the 4 components really relate around those 4 large in-task areas, and after conversation with the task force and with the field, this really, I think, was much clearer way to present this information. So none of these components were new per se, but they needed to be clarified more with the field. And so by organizing them this way, I think that was accomplished. So we embedded the in-task specific standards that we were looking for within each component as well. So EPPs were clear about which parts of in-task they were to address in which components. In Standard 2, again, not a lot of change, but we did in our 2.3 add the modality piece to the list of what the design and implementation of clinical experiences. So it's the using various modalities. And so that was the addition there. And then we, again, did some word smithing and efficiency work on the wording. Standard 3 does look a lot different, and I want to point out the major difference. So, you know, we used to have our old 3.2, which had the test score requirement and the GPA. The GPA has stayed. The cohorted grade point average of 3.0 is still in our 3.2. However, the testing requirement is no longer part of that component. And our 3.3 really talks about competency at completion. And this was the field's suggestion for a more authentic way of reviewing candidate competency. And so at the completion of the program, what are those measures that you are using to ensure that your candidates are competent in pedagogical skills, content knowledge, technology? And so, you know, really looking at those and coming up with criteria and thresholds for what those measures need to be in order for candidates to be recommended for licensing or going into the field. And so that was a huge change. So there is not a testing requirement in Standard 3 anymore. Of course, you can use some testing requirements if you have them at completion. If there's content tests or other things that you're using, you're free to still use them, but you're going to have to demonstrate those competencies of the completer. So I think your completion competencies. So that is, I think, a big change in Standard 3. Standard 4, we again did a little bit of consolidation, but really added flexibility to 4.1. So clarifying what the expectation was and making sure that EPPs were clear about what they could do to meet the completer effectiveness measures here. So I think that was a positive change as well. We did not do much change to R4.2 or R4.3. And then Standard 5, we again reorganized the components so that they flowed a little bit better, made it a little bit easier for EPPs to write to because it was in an ordered fashion. So the quality assurance system is still one, that's the structure and process. The data comes from that structure and process, and the quality of data is evaluated in R5.2. That data is then shared with stakeholders, which became R5.3. And those decisions then are made for continuous improvement, which is R5.4. And so, so again, not a lot of content, but differences, but reorganization of the components for a clearer articulation of the expectations. So I did want to talk a little bit about the broad concepts within the Cape standard. So we do have these themes of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we explicitly stated and embedded them within components instead of in an overall kind of holistic crosscut. And so I think I wanted to just point out some of the places that we see that. So EPPs are integrating diversity, equity, and inclusion in courses and curricula, and that's articulated in standard R1 in all the components of R1. And so that is a change. To have that be explicitly stated and required. Clinical experiences address both diversity of experience as well as diversity of P12 students. That is our standard 2. And you know, really looking at those experiences for candidates and preparing them to teach all students. And then the EPPs monitor and document candidate supports and disaggregate data by groups to determine support needs. That's standard 3, R3. And that's a critical piece to connect to the work that you're doing in the other standards, is making sure that you're monitoring and documenting the supports that are needed. And again, a diversity, equity, and inclusion concept that is embedded within the components of standard 3. Technology is also a broad concept woven through the standards and now explicitly stated. So state or nationally recognized technology standards is in R1. And so really working on expanding the technology digital portfolio or expectations for how to meet those technology standards and providing evidence was a big change. Clinical practice incorporates experiences with virtual or hybrid classrooms. And again, a timely addition to standard 2. And then agile systems and processes that allow for timely data analysis, reporting, and decisions. And that's standard 5. So really working on technologically advanced systems that can provide data in a timely fashion and can report and document decisions was a key technology element as well in standard 5. So, so we've gone over kind of all the standards and the revisions and also the broad concepts. And Chris mentioned our virtual visits and the process that we've sort of undertaken in 2020, and I think will be our new normal for 2021. And so we do want to open up the floor for any questions from the group, and we're happy to answer anything related to Cape, and we have plenty of time to do that now.